and believes in my integrity and my ability to redeem it upon demand. So it comes to Ian. And Ian comes up to me one day and he says, Vern, I got this IOU for 10 pounds of potatoes. Will you redeem it? And I say, certainly. And I reach down and I pick up 10 pounds of potatoes and I hand it to Ian. And Ian hands me the IOU. And what do I do with the IOU? Tear it up. It served its purpose. We may have had 100, if not 1,000 transactions that have just taken place, flip, 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 throughout society over the last week, 10 days, month, whatever. Money served its purpose. It was an IOU. Now, the only difference between that scenario, that basic primitive scenario, and what we have today is that the government has taken, or should have taken, and I will explain that differently, should have taken the constitutional authority to issue those IOUs for the nation so that they can be universally redeemable, so that you don't have to worry about knowing me if you live in Halifax, or knowing me in Edmonton if you live in Vancouver. So the government's function is to make those IOUs universally redeemable. That's the only difference. But they are claims to wealth. They are not wealth. So where does money come from? By the way, you and I earn money. Banks make money. You and I earn money. Banks make money. If you and I were to try to make money, they would call that counterfeiting. And after you've seen the presentation today, it's actually in reverse. We should be making the money. What they're doing is counterfeiting. Let's take a look at the situation in Canada. In 1867, which is where we'll start this chart, can everybody see this okay? In 1867, Canada, and we won't get into a debate about Canada even existing, which there's a fair bit of evidence to show that we don't even exist as a country, but let's go past that for now. And in 1867, ostensibly when we came together, when the BNA Act came through, we were virtually debt-free. In the 46 years from 1867 to 1913, we only accumulated, after putting together a postal system, developing roads, developing a railroad, putting together the armed forces, putting together an infrastructure, up to 1913, we only were in debt to the tune of $500 million. Now, that's not a lot of money after 46 years and doing all of those things. We were in debt. In 1913, there were 5 countries in the Western world that all did the same thing. Coincidence? Coincidence. For the American friends in our audience, the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. In Canada, the Bank Act was passed in 1913. And in 3 other countries in the world, New Zealand and two other smaller countries, all did the same thing. They gave up the constitutional authority of the government of those nations to issue the credit of that nation interest-free. And they gave it to a private organization. So in 1913, we had the Bank Act. Because we allowed the private interests to issue the money now as an interest-bearing debt, we now incurred a debt up to 1917 that was 4 times the previous 46 years. We went from $500 million in debt to over $2 billion by 1917. So they say, lo and behold, what are we going to do about this? We have to pay this interest to the bankers somehow. So they passed the Income War Tax Act and sold the people of Canada on the fact that we needed this income tax to pay for the war. But it wasn't for that at all. It was to pay back this illegal, unnecessary, and unlawful interest. Then we come from 1917, when this started to happen, we come into the 60s, and a major thing happened in the 60s. Does anybody know what that major thing was in the 60s that happened? I'm sorry? Absolutely. They took the ceiling off the 6% in the 60s. And so what happened there? I call the chart that I'm about to draw the hockey stick. It illustrates the magic of compound interest. Once they took the floating rate away and allowed it to go, we all know what happened in the late 70s, early 80s. This is what happened to the debt. And that's where it is right now. It is asymptoting to infinity. It is going up so fast, and that's just the federal government. It's at the point now where it's close to $700 billion. $700 billion. That's just the federal. Not the provincial, not the municipal, not the regional. When you add that together, it's probably closer now to about $2.2 trillion in debt. Just those four entities. When you add the private debt, that's what you have in your mortgage, what you have in your car payments, what you have in your credit cards, etc., we're very close to $4.7 trillion in debt. And they tell us we owe it to ourselves. Well, that's just one of the many myths that we're going to talk about today and dispel, I hope. We've been told for years that the reason we're in so much debt, it's the fault of our rotten, profligate, spendthrift government. How many people here believe that? Well, you should. It's true. But for very different reasons than what we've been told. Yes, they do overspend the income. Yes, they do all these things, such as the studying of the mating practices of the Anopheles mosquito, such as the other boondoggles. But the very different reasons are the basics that we're going to go through here. So let's go back to basics. How does money come into society? How does it come into any society in the world? Whether it be the United States, Canada, it's all very similar. What I'm going to be doing here today is Canadianized. So for the American people, just put in, where I'm about to put in Bank of Canada, just put in Federal Reserve. So how does it come in? Precisely, by debt. I'm sorry, Teresa? Well, you're making a statement that presupposes, of course, that the money had to exist. I'm going right back to the beginning. And I'm saying, where does it start from? How does it come into creation in the very beginning? Keep in mind the little example that I gave here of the circulation of the money. Where did that money come into creation in the very beginning? I actually created it out of nothing. I mean, other than a piece of paper and some ink. I created that money. It was an IOU. It was money as soon as he accepted it. He accepted my obligation. And as long as those two things, very, very important, ability and integrity. If I had the if I don't have the potatoes, but I have every intention of redeeming it, you're still no further ahead if I don't have them. And if I do have them and I have no intention of honoring my IOU, you're still no further ahead. You've got to have both. So, how does money come in? Somebody said by debt, and that's absolutely correct. It does come in by debt. But it comes through a very narrow mechanism. And I'm going to use some short forms here. And I apologize about this. I had all these done on overheads, but it's just not picking up with all the sunlight here. We just can't pick it up on the overhead, so I'm having to go through it in this way. For people who would like some of these charts later on, I will be happy to make copies and have them available over at our table there. So basically, we have the introduction of money into society comes in through two major ways, but only one channel. Now, there are subsets to these entities, but ultimately, it's the Bank of Canada and the chartered banks. And it turns out that in the last audited statement, the Bank of Canada put into circulation 2.5%, and the chartered banks 97.5%. What does the word charter mean when it's applied to chartered accountant, chartered bank? It means that that entity got that designation or that authority to do something from the government. They got a charter from the government, whether it's an accountant. You always got to keep that in mind when you're dealing with an accountant. An accountant cannot properly do for you what you need to have done when you're talking about your taxes, because he is held by the rules and the dictates that were put down by the very people you ultimately are fighting against. So you can't possibly get past that conflict of interest. The same thing, although we're deviating slightly, the same thing applies to lawyers. A lawyer is an officer of the court. He is held by the rules that the government puts down, that govern what he does in his profession. If he steps beyond those bounds, those boundaries, one of many things could happen to him. One is, depending on how far he goes beyond, he could be disbarred, he could be censured, he could be taken to task by the judge, or if he rallies too vociferously on behalf of his client, he could face the proposition that he is never going to win another case against that judge should he come up against him again. So there are many reasons why a lawyer, when he's up against the government, cannot properly represent you. It's an ultimate conflict of interest. Actually, the more ultimate is the judge who's paid by the very people you're fighting against. That is why Magna Charta put in that when you are in dispute with, and of course Magna Charta said the king, but today we can translate that and call that the government. When you are in dispute with the king or the government, you must be tried in front of a jury of the peers of the neighborhood. And that only stands to reason, because a judge that's put into place by the king has put you in a position where the judge is in a conflict of interest. So, getting back to the situation here, we have the Bank of Canada producing 2.5% and the chartered banks producing 97.5%. Now, those are fluctuating possibly as much as 1% or 2% from those numbers over the last reconciliation. Of the money that comes into circulation, of all money that comes in to circulation, 2.5% of that money has been put in through some kind of debt instrument, such as a treasury bill, okay? And in the case of the chartered banks, they put it in through what I'm going to get to next. Now, how does that money come in? As somebody said, it all comes in as a debt. This is the only conduit, the only pipe, the only way into society that the money enters. As we say, we got credit cards and we have chartered banks and we have trust companies, but it's all the same thing. It all channels through the same conduit. Who authorizes these groups to create this money and then introduce it into society? Ultimately, we do. Various entities of us. And there are really only three groupings of us. Somebody said the government. They were absolutely correct. Any other entity? Absolutely. And there's really only one other entity. You and me, the individuals. Yeah, we've got the banks up here. Now, who authorizes those banks? See, those banks just can't do it out of nothing. They do it out of nothing, but they've got to have authorization for it. So we have individuals. Now, can they create that money out of nothing with unlimited authorization? Actually, no, they can't. They have to have some kind of backing for it. So we have different groups of backing. Over here, we have the individuals. And this is what we call, in all instances, collateralization. I don't think I'm going to get that on here. In the case of individuals, the collateralization can be homes, cars, anything else. Sorry? Farms, absolutely, great one.
Real property.
Yep, real estate. Anything else?
Quotas.
Gee, that's a good one. Yeah, that's a good one. I hadn't thought of that one. That's a really good one. Who said that? Okay, Ed, did you say quotas, Ed? Yes. Okay, would you go get a prize from Bob over there? I do things a little bit differently.
Signature.
Yeah, labor. Okay, signature is what authorizes it. You're getting ahead of me there, but that's okay.
Explain quotas.
Actually, Ed, I would love you to talk about that.
Quotas are an assumable product that people pay for that are already existing, but we have to go through these channels of government, assuming now they hold value, which we once owned. We give them our liberties to facilitate plunder on our own selves, like be it dairy, be it forestry, be it mining. Yeah, they have a very unique way of stealing from us again. And as dairy farmers, they pay millions of dollars. Just out of salmon arm here, we're probably looking at about $23 million of the quotas within a 10-kilometer radius of tax.
That's a really good one, Ed. I appreciate you bringing that one up. It's one I had not thought about. Keith.
How about the hypothecation of debt through artificial persons like the birth certificate? That's something different. Collateralizing people as natural resources.
I appreciate what Dr. Nick Begich talked about yesterday and the hard evidence in that. And that makes a lot of sense to me, Keith. But I have yet to see the absolute hard evidence. I don't dispute it. I'm so